What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. I'm your host, once again, Ryan Thomas, bringing you another edition of the Thomas Take. And guess what? Last night's show, in case you don't watch the shows on my Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page, last night's Buffalo Bills postgame show was on fire. That was a good one. That was fun. A lot to talk about, obviously, in the world of the NFL. There's a lot to talk about. A lot to talk about in the world of the Buffalo Bills. Post-benching Tyrod Taylor for Nate Peterman for the Week 11 game with the Week 10 game, or Week 11 game, with the Week 11, with the LA Chargers. And I talked extensively about that on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Facebook page, so I kind of want to move on from that. I feel like I've kind of beaten it like a dead horse, and I always try to do that, try to avoid doing that, I should say. So I want to move on. Today is Monday, which means that it is MMA Monday, the world of mixed martial arts. Obviously, I am a massive mixed martial arts fan, and I enjoy the sport just as much as I enjoy football. So there's been a lot of stuff, a lot of headlines going on inside the sport that I really haven't had the chance to tackle due to the fact that I've been doing my Bill stuff, doing my Rock Sports Report articles, and I haven't really given the Spreaker crowd or the iTunes crowd much MMA content. And I got a lot of listeners of the show that tune in and listen to the Thomas Take and always ask me, when is your MMA stuff? Because that's really what the backbone of the podcast, that's where it kind of started a couple years ago. So really, I want to kind of get back to that mostly on Mondays, do the Sunday Bill stuff, MMA on Mondays, and then stuff in between on Thursday. So where do I start? Realistically, there were so many storylines throughout this month. UFC 217 took off November 4th. It was a huge event. It was a successful event for the UFC, apparently generating somewhere around 800,000 pay-per-views, and I'm switching rooms here, so just be mindful of any sounds you hear. It was upstairs, and now I'm moving downstairs to the downstairs studio situation. So there were a lot of situations that presented themselves this year that were definite highlights of the MMA year. UFC 217 was one of them. We got to see an amazing card to say the least, with Michael Bisping, George St. Pierre, Cody Garbrandt defending his belt versus TJ Dillashaw, or not defending his belt versus TJ Dillashaw. And realistically, that was as good a card as you're ever going to get. 3 title changes in one night. It was a definite high for the UFC. A definite, holy crap, did that just happen? Did we just see that? How could it get much better than that? So, as I collect my thoughts here, moving on from that, we've had nothing but just weird storylines inside the sport of MMA. It has been nothing but negative, and the culprit of that is former pound-for-pound greatest, quote-unquote, greatest of all-time fighter, Anderson the Spider Silva, a guy that dominated the UFC middleweight division for 7 years, from 2006 to 2013. This guy was the face of mixed martial arts, the biggest name in the sport, the biggest draw that the sport had ever had, alongside George St. Pierre, dominated virtually every contender that was put in front of him, and then some, knocking these guys out in emphatic fashion. This past week, he's scheduled to fight Kelvin Gastelum. It was a UFC Fight Pass card, which is basically UFC Netflix for all the people that don't know what it is. Subscribers pay $10 a month for it. You get to watch certain fights. You get to see certain matchups that, most people don't get to see because most people don't have it. It hasn't really gotten big yet. So, he tests positive again, according to the USADA, drug testing procedure. Drug testing policy. He tests positive again, the second time that he has tested positive. And people keep asking me, Ryan, what do you think of Anderson Silva? What do you think of... So, is he a GOAT, which stands for greatest of all time in the sports circles, or is he a fraud? Pre-USADA, this guy was dominating everyone. Pre-USADA, he was knocking everyone out. Pre-USADA, he looked untouchable. Now, post-USADA, not only is he an older man, he's past his prime as a fighter, but it is blatantly obvious that in his later years he has used performance-enhancing drugs, whether that's Viagra, which was one of them, or something else. So, Michael the Count Bisping takes his spot for this fight versus Kelvin Gastelum 3 weeks later off of his terrible, UFC loss. It was probably one of the worst performances of his career. He had his moments in there, but realistically, a fight in which he lost his title, not a good night for him, probably the worst night of his career. The best night being that when he won the title, the worst night being when he lost it. That only makes sense. That's just common sense on my end from following Michael Bisping throughout his career. So he takes this fight, takes this opportunity to right a wrong in his career, get back in the win column, a mere 3 weeks after his title loss, and he's stepping in for Anderson Silva. Bisping said on his podcast, Believe You Me, that it's very tough for him to believe that Anderson Silva never used performance-enhancing drugs pre-USADA. And I 100% agree with him. You don't start using steroids when you're 40. You start using steroids usually when you're in your early 30s, or late 20s, early 30s, or, mid 30s. He's past his prime in his career. Why would a light bulb go off in his head to start using performance enhancers now when the United States Anti-Doping Agency is involved in the UFC, is the governing body that is involved in the UFC in terms of drug testing? Why would he decide to do that now? Furthermore, this guy has completely tried to avoid the United States Anti-Doping Agency by fighting in areas where there is no United States Anti-Doping Agency, obviously because the fight is not in the United States. The UFC has become much more strict in years past. One guy that comes to mind, Vitor Belfort, was able to bend the rules, break through the system, and continue to manipulate the rules due to the fact that he was not fighting in the United States. The UFC has kind of put a stranglehold on it, that USADA is the governing body for the entire organization, for the entire operation. So, is Anderson Silva a fraud? Is he the greatest of all time? I am honestly going to go out on a limb and answer no to both. He's not the greatest of all time. He's not a fraud. I'm not going to take away the accomplishments that he had because, much like him, many of the other fighters that were in his era were competing with steroids. But in a month, that featured the return of George St. Pierre, coming off a 4-year layoff, fighting in a division that he had never fought in, fighting versus a champion, a natural middleweight, a longtime middleweight in Michael Bisping, and dispatching Bisping in the fashion that he did. And then, oddly enough, a week and a half later, a drug test is once again positive for Anderson Silva. If that doesn't scream who the real greatest of all time is, I don't know what will. We talk about this all the time in all sports. Who's the greatest of all time? Who's the best? Who's the best to ever do it? Guess what? It's not Anderson Silva. It's just not. I don't care how many knockouts he had. I don't care who he finished. The body of work, in my opinion, was always more impressive on the career of George St. Pierre. as opposed to Anderson Silva. Really, I can name 3 out of the many challengers that he had, maybe 4 of the many challengers that he had to his title that were actually legit fighters, maybe 5. Off the top of my head, Weidman would obviously be one of them. Maia, Sonnen, Dan Henderson, and there might be another one sprinkled in there. Rich Franklin, obviously, being that he was a former champion. But, really 5 out of the 10 title defenses, half of the 10 title defenses that he had were not legit, really. He was facing Nate Marquardt and Talis Latis, and obviously that was the era back then. That was the best that the era had to offer in terms of contenders for Anderson Silva. So it's tough to say that the guy was not up to par, but in comparison to the fighters of today, the game has just evolved, and we've seen Anderson Silva look completely shell-shocked, just decimated physically in some of his most recent performances. I thought he lost to Derek Brunson. He definitely looked lackadaisical, shall I say, in that fight. And he's just not as strong as he once was. And that just begs the question, was it ever natural? Was he ever natural? That is the tough question that we're always going to ask ourselves now that Anderson Silva is in his second situation where he is tested positive for steroids. The USADA organization dictates that if you test positive not once but twice, you could very well be suspended for as many as 4 years. So Anderson Silva is obviously on the back end of his career. Most of his opposition is retired or close to retired or should be retired. In the case of guys like Bisping and Dan Henderson and Chael Sonnen and guys like that, most of the opposition from his era is on the outs or on the way out. So, is out or on the way out, I should say. So, Anderson Silva really doesn't have much left. He's not going to get a title shot. He's not going to make a title push. It's just not the case. He's past his prime. And the reality of the situation is, who really cares? I mean, and I'm not saying it like derogatory but who cares in the big picture? Silva's not going to get a title shot. He's not going to get another opportunity to get a second crack or third crack at his belt. That came and went. The middleweight division has evolved. Guys like Luke Rockhold and Yoel Romero and Robert Whittaker obviously being the interim champ, and now George St. Pierre being the UFC middleweight champion. Really, the opportunity for the UFC to make a super fight with GSP and Anderson Silva kind of came and went, and really it never was. So it's very tough for me to hear fans say, well, maybe he can fight GSP for a super fight, the big money fight. No, that would be a joke. Anderson Silva has won, I think, 1 of his last 5 fights or 2 of his last 6 fights, something of that nature. So the UFC is ready, willing, and able to have him headline an event, but it's not going to be on pay-per-view. It's not going to be on FS1. He's not a draw anymore. Those days are over. It's tough to say, being that it was an exciting era, but the days of Anderson Silva being what he once was are far gone. I think that he will come back sooner than 4 years. I think he will make his return. I don't know what the logistics are of this situation in terms of the legalities of it, but I'm very happy that Michael Bisping felt the need to take the fight, as he has always been a classic case of a guy that has done things the right way. And Anderson Silva, despite many of his impressive performances, has always been a classic case of a guy that has done all the wrong things in his later half of his career. Shame on you, Anderson Silva. Shame on you for doing this yet again, putting the UFC in this position yet again, and shame on you for disappointing the legion of fans that you have, and then putting out this phony cookie-cutter statement, I'll be back, we're going to get this worked through. No, you tested positive, you bent the rules, you cheated. It's no one else's fault but your own. I'm Ryan Thomas. That was the Thomas Take. Anderson Silva, GOAT or fraud? I say no to both.